several days had passed since the dramatic conclusion of the Crimson Shadow affair. The frantic life-or-death urgency of the case had subsided, replaced by the familiar, comforting rhythms of our life at 221B Baker Street. The London fog, a constant and recurring character in the drama of our lives, once again pressed its grey, ghostly face against our window panes, muffling the sounds of the city and creating a sense of cozy, intellectual isolation. The newspapers had been filled with sensationalist accounts of the case, their headlines screaming of secret societies, daring rooftop chases, and the dramatic capture of the notorious Colonel Sebastian Moran. Inspector Lestrade, as Holmes had predicted, had taken the lion's share of the public credit, his name and photograph featuring prominently in every article. Holmes was mentioned only in passing, a shadowy anonymous figure who had provided some unofficial assistance to the police. This arrangement suited my friend perfectly. He had no interest in public acclaim. His only desire was for the intellectual stimulation of the work itself. I was seated at my writing desk, attempting to chronicle the events of the case for my own personal records. I was struggling, as I so often did, to find the words that could do justice to the complexity of the affair, to the brilliance of my friend's deductions, and to the dark, tangled web of human emotion that lay at its heart. How could I capture the raw, burning sense of injustice that had fueled the Crimson Shadow? How could I convey the diabolical, narcissistic genius of Colonel Moran? Holmes himself was in one of his more contemplative, almost languid moods. He sat in his armchair, enveloped in a cloud of blue smoke from his old blackened clay pipe, his eyes closed, his long, slender fingers steepled before him. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, his mind, I knew, sifting through the details of the case, re-examining every clue, every piece of testimony, every nuance of behavior. For Holmes, a case was never truly over, even when the culprit was behind bars. It was a puzzle to be turned over and over in his mind, to be examined from every possible angle, until every last lingering question had been answered to his satisfaction. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said suddenly, his voice emerging from the cloud of smoke, calm and meditative. "The human capacity for self-deception. It is a force more powerful than any army, more insidious than any poison." I put down my pen, intrigued by this sudden philosophical turn. "To whom are you referring, Holmes?" I asked. "To Moran." "To Lord Vance?" "To both," he replied, opening his eyes. They were clear and sharp, their usual languor replaced by a familiar analytical gleam. "And to another player in this little drama, a player whose role we have, I believe, underestimated." He rose from his chair and began to pace the room, his worn dressing gown trailing behind him. It was a familiar ritual, the physical manifestation of his mind in motion. "We have brought the case to a successful, if tragic, conclusion," he said. "We have rescued the victim. We have captured the villain. We have dismantled the conspiracy. The world, and Inspector Lestrade, is satisfied. But I am not. There is a loose thread, Watson. A small, nagging inconsistency that troubles me. A detail that does not quite fit the otherwise perfect, if horrifying, logic of the affair." He stopped his pacing and turned to face me, his eyes boring into mine. "Consider the initial stages of the case, Watson. The shadowy figure in the garden, the painted symbols, the campaign of psychological terror. It was all designed to frighten one person, and one person alone, Lady Eleanor Vance. Of course, I said. It was Moran's way of applying pressure, of adding a layer of personal terror to his plan. Was it? Holmes countered, a skeptical eyebrow raised. But to what end? Moran's primary targets were the officers who had betrayed him. The terrorizing of Lady Vance seems, in retrospect, a rather unnecessary and elaborate theatricality. Moran is a man of ruthless efficiency. He is not given to superfluous gestures, unless they serve a very specific purpose. He resumed his pacing, his mind working at a furious pace. And then there's the matter of Lord Vance's disappearance. He was taken from his study, a room at the back of the house, in the dead of night. And yet, the first of the Crimson Shadows was painted on the front door, a public declaration for all the world to see. Why the discrepancy? Why the public display for a secret abduction? He was, as he so often did, pointing out the small, seemingly insignificant details that my own, less observant mind had overlooked. He was weaving them together, creating a new pattern, a new and startling interpretation of the facts. "And what of Lady Vance herself?" he continued, his voice low and intense. "A woman of intelligence and fortitude, a woman who by her own admission knew that her husband harbored a dark secret from his past. And yet she seemed so completely surprised, so utterly devastated by the events that unfolded." He stopped and picked up the letter she had sent us, the one containing the generous check. He studied it for a moment, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "The handwriting, Watson," he said, holding the letter out to me. "Observe it. It is a strong hand, a confident hand, the hand of a woman who is accustomed to being in control. And yet, in her initial interview with us, she presented herself as a helpless, terrified victim." "But she was terrified, Holmes," I protested. "I saw it with my own eyes. Her fear was genuine." "Oh, her fear was genuine enough," Holmes conceded. "But what was the source of that fear? Was she afraid of the shadowy figure in her garden? Or was she afraid of something else entirely? Was she afraid of the truth? Afraid that the dark secret her husband had carried for 20 years was about to be brought into the light of day?" He was leading me down a path I hadn't considered, a path that led to a dark and unsettling conclusion. "What are you suggesting, Holmes?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath, the prelude to his final startling revelation. "I am suggesting, my dear Watson, that we have been the unwitting pawns in a far more subtle and complex game than we ever imagined. A game orchestrated not by Colonel Moran, but by the very woman who hired us to solve the case." I stared at him dumbfounded. "Lady Vance. But that is impossible. She was the victim." "Was she?" Holmes replied, his voice soft but insistent. "Or was she a master manipulator, a woman who saw a way to save her husband from a threat far greater than the Crimson Shadow?" He laid out his final deduction, a theory that was as brilliant as it was shocking. It recontextualized the entire case, turning our understanding of it completely on its head. "Lady Vance, I believe, knew more than she ever let on," he began, his voice taking on the familiar didactic tone of a professor lecturing his student. "She knew of the Quetta affair, perhaps not in detail, but she knew that her husband had been involved in something shameful, something that could destroy his reputation and their life together. and she knew that his past was coming back to haunt him. He surmised that Lord Vance, his conscience finally getting the better of him, had been contacted by Moran, or by one of the other members of the Crimson Shadow. He had been given an ultimatum to surrender himself to their justice, or to see his family, his wife, drawn into the scandal. Lord Vance, being a man of a certain old-fashioned honor, Holmes continued, chose to sacrifice himself. His disappearance was not an abduction in the true sense of the word. It was a voluntary surrender. He walked out of his study that night and went to meet his fate in the hope of sparing his wife from the fallout. But Lady Vance, I interjected, she would not have simply allowed him to go. "Precisely, Watson," Holmes exclaimed, his eyes gleaming. "She would not. She is a woman of action, a woman of control. She wouldn't stand idly by while her husband marched off to his doom. She would devise a plan to save him not just from the Crimson Shadow, but from his own guilt, from his own past." And so, the final astonishing piece of the puzzle fell into place. "It was she, Watson," Holmes declared, his voice ringing with a quiet, triumphant finality. "It was Lady Vance who painted the first Crimson Shadow on her own front door. It was she who created the narrative of the shadowy figure, the campaign of terror. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit. She could not stop her husband from surrendering himself, but she could reframe the narrative. She could transform his surrender into a mysterious criminal abduction." The logic was flawless, the conclusion inescapable. Lady Vance had created a mystery, a puzzle so strange and compelling that it would attract the attention of the one man in London who could solve it, Sherlock Holmes. "She did not hire us to find her husband, Watson," Holmes explained. "She knew in a general sense where he was. She hired us to rescue him. She created a crime so that we would have a reason to intervene. She used us, our skills, our reputation, as a weapon against the Crimson Shadow. She pointed us at Moran, knowing that in our pursuit of the truth, we would inevitably dismantle his organization and, in doing so, save her husband from their clutches." It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, a manipulation of the highest order. Lady Vance had not been our client. She had been our puppet master. Her fear was real, Holmes concluded, but it was the fear of a gambler who has staked everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. She was afraid that her plan would fail, that we would be too late, that her husband would be killed before we could reach him. But she was also afraid that we would succeed, and that in succeeding, we would uncover the very truth she was trying to conceal. The final deduction cast a new and unsettling light on the entire affair. It revealed a layer of human complexity, of moral ambiguity, that was far more profound than the simple black and white narrative of heroes and villains we had constructed. Lady Vance was not a villain. She was a woman who had used deception and manipulation to save the man she loved. Her methods were questionable, but her motives were, in their own way, pure. "And what of Lord Vance?" I asked. "Does he know of his wife's role in this?" Holmes shook his head. "I do not believe so. He is a man of a simpler, more direct moral code. He would not understand or condone his wife's methods. She has saved his life, but she has done so by weaving a web of deception that must now, for the sake of the future together, remain forever unbroken." He fell silent, his final deduction hanging in the air between us, a testament to the strange, often paradoxical, nature of the human heart. The case of the Crimson Shadow was not just a story of greed and revenge. It was also a story of love, of sacrifice, and of the desperate, extraordinary measures that people will take to protect the ones they hold dear. As I sat there, my pen forgotten, my chronicle of the case now seeming woefully incomplete, Holmes picked up his violin. He did not play one of his usual melancholic airs, but a piece that was complex, intricate, and filled with a strange, almost unsettling beauty. It was a piece that seemed to capture the very essence of the case, its shifting moods, its hidden depths, its moral ambiguities. It was a piece that spoke of the darkness and the light that coexist in every human soul. The final lingering notes of the violin faded into the quiet of the room, leaving a profound and contemplative silence in their wake. Holmes placed the instrument carefully back in its case and turned to me, a faint, enigmatic smile on his lips. "The world is a complex place, my dear Watson," he said, his voice a soft final commentary on the extraordinary events of the past few days. "And the truth is rarely pure and never simple. And that, perhaps, is what makes this grim old city of ours, with its fogs and its shadows, such an endlessly fascinating place to live." He stood and looked out of the window at the swirling grey mists that shrouded the world outside. The case was over. The last deduction had been made, and all that was left was the quiet, the smoke, and the enduring, insoluble mystery of the human heart.